How is it possible, with all of the tutorials that Final Fantasy XIV gives you, some that they even shove right in your face, and some that even give you rewards for taking them, that so many players have no idea how to do certain things, or how you're supposed to play certain jobs or roles? How is it possible for a healer to reach level 90 without ever realizing they're supposed to be attacking when there's nothing to heal, when the tutorial says so right there? How is it possible that some tanks refuse to dodge telegraphs and think they're just supposed to just stand there and take it, when the first tutorial for tanks is to avoid them? How is it actually possible that there are players that get how to play a job so wrong when there are basic tutorials in the game and so many guides on the internet that surely they can't possibly miss it? Or can they? Well, there are a bunch of different reasons why this could be the case, and of course, what exactly went wrong depends on the individual. But some things are more likely to fail simply because of a badly presented tutorial. So, in this video, I would like to discuss some of the problems with the tutorial options new players, and veterans in some respects, have for learning how to do combat in Final Fantasy XIV. Now, let's start with the worst type of tutorial, the text pop-up. When you unlock a new feature of some sort, or for the first time access it, a pop-up active help tutorial appears, explaining in varying detail what it is you're dealing with. For example, when you reach level 2 as a thaumaturge, you get this pop-up, explaining Umbral, Ice and Astral Fire, which in vague terms explain that Astral Fire stops MP recovery, makes Ice magic weaker and makes Fire magic stronger, while also explaining that Umbral Ice makes Ice magic cheaper, increases MP recovery and makes Fire magic weaker. If you started as a thaumaturge, you will not engage combat before around level 4, and there will be plenty of cutscenes before you even get to play with this. If, on the other hand, this is not your first job, this is almost certain to pop up while you're actively out in the field fighting stuff. I imagine the majority of players immediately pressed the X and closed the window and thought, "I'll figure it out myself, thank you." This is a rather common problem with text dump tutorials, as they expect you to simply read it, and often gives you no opportunity to test your understanding of the subject matter at all. In fact, not only does it not give you an opportunity to test your understanding of the subject, it also gives the game no opportunity to test whether you actually understood it, in case it was important. It doesn't matter whether it is about the job gauge of a job, how the hunting log works, what the limit break is, or how your mount works. As long as it is mainly taught through just a text dump tutorial, it is almost certain that the player did not read it. Next up are the practical tutorials of the game, featuring the MSQ, a few class quests, and the Smith. Now, if you are a DPS job, for the most part, you will make it through all these tutorial-like tasks somewhat unscathed, as, obviously, you need to attack. Hopefully you either intuitively understood how combo actions worked if you chose a melee job, or you read the text dump about it, but for the most part you'll probably be fine. Similarly, if you are a tank, you won't need to understand all the tank technicalities to beat any of these tasks, and as long as you approach it as a slightly burlier DPS job, you will be fine. Although, to be fair, the Hall of the Novice does actually teach tanks how to do combos. As a healer though, you will be met with some surprises. You will have to fight things on your own, so you will be well acquainted with attacking through both your MSQ and your class quests. In fact, even the class quest outright demands you to fight and attack, so it should be clear that healers should be attacking in combat. Right? Should you seek out the Smith for the optional, that's a problem, healing tutorial that awards you with some equipment for your efforts, the task teaching you about keeping your party alive also notes that you should be attacking when no one needs healing. So everything in the game is essentially telling you that you should be attacking as a healer, even the unavoidable quests. How then is it possible that healers can reach even the first dungeon without realizing this? Well, there are a handful of reasons for this. In nearly all of the situations where there is even a single other character on the field, you can technically win as a healer without attacking, choosing to simply heal instead. Most solo duties in these starting levels will have an extra NPC on the field to help you, and if you keep them healthy, they can almost certainly win the battle for you. While the Smith's tutorial will be yelling at you to attack, in text, if you aren't, the fight will eventually be won whether you attack or not. So every tutorial trying to teach you to attack is invalidated by the simple fact that if there are other characters on the field, you don't have to attack. Meaning that these healer players may come to the wrong conclusion that the only reason healers have attacks is to deal with enemies when they are alone. That argument is even easier to make when you enter your first dungeon and realize that you have 2 players specifically designated as damage dealers, meaning you aren't a damage dealer by comparison. You're the healer, so you heal. This also applies to tanks. Rare is the tank that does this, but there are tanks that believe their only job is to hold the attention of the enemies and survive. Some even rarer tanks believe it's the healer's problem to make sure the tank survives. How does that happen? Well, once again, in the tutorials, the tank can win by just pressing fast blade or heavy swing and keeping the attention of the enemies. There isn't a requirement to use Rampart. The NPC will top you up if you need it. And again, in a dungeon, there's damage dealers, and you are a tank. I know these arguments sound absolutely absurd for someone who knows how to play the game, and you could argue that, naturally, a tank should realize they could attack more for more damage. They should realize they could use defensive cooldowns to help the healer. A healer could help with attacking. But then again, if the healer starts attacking, it might impede their ability to heal when someone actually needs it. So why risk it? Why should the tank distract themselves from tanking by doing more complex attacks if the simple ones are enough for keeping the attention of the enemies? And why should they use a defensive cooldown preemptively? They need to keep that cooldown for when they actually need it. And the best way to know if you need a defensive cooldown is when an enemy is overwhelming you with damage, which is when it is actually already kind of too late for a defensive cooldown to save you. For those confused by tanks not using area of effect attacks, let me show you what it takes to beat the Smith's tutorial on tanking multiple targets. Notice how the teacher flat out tells you to use your area of effect attack, and names it before we start. Now, what it actually takes to beat this optional tutorial is only your first action. The healer has your back for everything else. You don't even need your tank stance, although the teacher does mention that one too, and it does make it a lot easier. Now, regardless of this, as this tutorial is optional, we can't assume players actually do it. What I'm trying to convey here is that most things that can be considered a tutorial for the game don't actually test your understanding of the game's mechanics, meaning that a tank could have completed every tutorial presented and still have not the faintest idea how to actually tank. If you simply turn on your tank stance, you can beat every mandatory dungeon and most any mandatory trial in the MSQ without ever understanding how your toolkit works. Similarly, a healer can beat every mandatory dungeon and most any trial in the MSQ by simply using their healing spells and nothing else. Just to be fair, a damage dealer can also beat most every mandatory dungeon and most any trial in the MSQ without actually using very much of their toolkit. As long as things are dying, we are winning, right? I also just want to quickly highlight that the first time the game expects you to use Limit Break, nowadays, is in the fight with the Ultima weapon, where they hand you an otherwise impossible Limit Break 3 in a 4-man party, but doesn't really explain to you how to do it or what it is for, and you're on a time limit. And when the actual game tutorials fail on their own, the best alternative is asking other players or looking up guides elsewhere. But if a new healer watches a max level healer guide, they will be told to mainly use their OGCDs for healing and focus on attacking. With what OGCDs exactly? It isn't uncommon for a tank guide to simply point you to turn on your tank stance, pull until you meet a wall, and then faceplant on your defensive cooldowns in AoE. However, if you try that in your first go in Sastasha, you're almost certainly going to wipe, shattering your trust in the guide. Other guides might say to pace yourself, but the simple fact that the answer varies between person to person makes it very confusing for a new player. With all that said, how do you make a good tutorial? Hard to say. I believe a common recommendation for a good tutorial is demonstrating how a feature works, and then having a test that can only be succeeded by making use of the feature itself. For example, if you want to teach how interrupting works in Final Fantasy XIV, A way to do it would be to somehow demonstrate interrupting an attack in a mandatory tutorial, if you want to be sure the player gets it, and then have a test that cannot be beaten unless the player correctly uses their interrupt. However, a key problem here is that the result of such a mandatory tutorial can be one of a few things. The player learned, understood, and correctly dealt with the test, learning how interrupts work. The player banged their head against the test until they randomly pressed interrupt at the right time and beat the test, learning nothing. The player gave up and quit the game. What I mean by this is that a tutorial that does not let you proceed until you get it can be very effective at making sure the player understands the content of the tutorial, assuming it is important. However, if the player is unwilling to learn the mechanic or feature, then it simply becomes a painful and frustrating part of the game, at worst causing the player to quit. The simple fact that most of Final Fantasy XIV can be beaten without understanding most of the basic mechanics of the game speaks volumes about the intended difficulty level of the casual part of the game, the mandatory progression part, the MSQ. While it would be nice if the average player in the game knew a bit more about how the game works and was a bit better at the game, the truth of the matter is that the tutorials are there, and if you want to learn, you can. The game simply does not try to force you to get it, which sometimes can cause players that do want to learn to miss the chance. So, while the built-in tutorials of Final Fantasy XIV are perhaps not the greatest, I wonder if the fact they are optional means that the tutorials can be enough for those that want to learn, without preventing those that would rather not from participating. But what do you think? Would it be better if the tutorials were stricter and mandatory, so you were certain the tank, healer, or DPS had some idea what they were doing, for certain, at the risk of turning away a lot of players that might have come around to learning the mechanics later down the line if given the time? Regardless, I would love to hear examples in the comments of how you would teach some of the features of the game that are expected to be known by the average player. Whether it is how to use defensive cooldowns as a tank, how to know when it is safe to attack as a healer, how a rotation works as a DPS, maybe even how abilities work. I would love to hear suggestions. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, the Smith's enmity generating tutorial for tanks actually teaches you how combos work, and it will not let you pass without getting it right. On the other hand, the basic damage dealing tutorial for a DPS does not teach you how to perform combos, which makes sense since not all damage dealers have combos. Furthermore, it also includes a line about enemies having a harder time avoiding blows from the flank or from behind, which is outdated information that is no longer relevant or helpful.